Rome didn't fall because of barbarians. It didn't fall because of weak emperors. The real reason Rome collapsed is so obvious that historians have been ignoring it for centuries. And once you see it, you'll never look at history the same way again. The Roman Empire was the most powerful civilization on Earth for over 500 years. They conquered most of the known world, built roads that still exist today, and created a system of government that influenced every democracy that came after. But then, in what feels like the blink of an eye in historical terms, it all came crashing down. And the wildest part, most of what you learned in school about why Rome fell is completely wrong. Today, I'm breaking down the actual reasons Rome collapsed, and trust me, some of these are going to blow your mind. We're covering everything from economic disasters to lead poisoning, from backstabbing emperors to literal plagues that wiped out millions. And I'm doing it all in under 30 minutes. Here's the thing about the fall of Rome. Everyone thinks they know the story. You probably learned in history class that barbarians invaded, and that was that. Rome fell, the Dark Ages began, end of story. But that's like saying the Titanic sank because it hit an iceberg and leaving it at that. Yeah, technically true, but you are missing about 99% of the actual story. The real fall of Rome is way more complicated and honestly way more interesting than just barbarians showed up. We're talking about centuries of slowly building problems that eventually created a perfect storm of disaster, economic collapse, political chaos, disease, climate change, and yes, even some truly terrible decisions by the people in charge. And here's what makes this so crazy. Rome didn't just fall once. It fell over and over again, in different ways for different reasons, across hundreds of years. The Western Roman Empire officially ended in 476 AD, but the problems that killed it started way earlier. Some historians argue the rot began as far back as the 3rd century, which means Rome spent roughly 200 years slowly dying. Think about that. 2 centuries of decline. That's longer than the United States has existed as a country. Imagine if America started falling apart right now and didn't officially collapse until the year 2224. That's the time frame we're dealing with here. So let's actually break down what happened, because this is one of the most fascinating disasters in human history. Let's start in the year 235 AD. Rome is still the dominant superpower. The empire stretches from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. Everything seems fine on the surface, but underneath, cracks are forming. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome had over 50 emperors. 50 in less than 50 years. And most of them didn't retire peacefully. They were murdered, usually by their own soldiers or political rivals. Some emperors lasted less than a year. One guy named Quintillus was emperor for only 17 days before he got killed. This wasn't just political drama. Every time an emperor died, the entire empire became unstable. Different generals would claim they should be emperor. Armies would fight each other instead of defending the borders. And while Romans were busy killing each other, enemies on the frontier saw their chance. Germanic tribes started pushing into Roman territory. The Persians attacked from the east. Pirates raided coastal cities. And Rome, which had spent centuries conquering everyone else, suddenly found itself on the defensive. But here's where it gets really bad. All these civil wars and invasions cost money, a lot of money, money that Rome didn't have. So the emperors did what broke governments always do. They devalued the currency. Roman coins were supposed to be made of silver, but the government started mixing in cheaper metals like copper and bronze. They'd make a coin that looked silver but was actually mostly junk metal. This is called debasing the currency, and it's basically ancient inflation. At the start of the 3rd century, Roman coins were about 95% silver. By the 262nd, they were less than 5% silver. Some coins were just copper with a thin silver coating that would rub off after a few uses. What happens when your money becomes worthless? Prices explode. Suddenly bread costs 10 times what it used to. A soldier's salary, which used to be enough to live on, now can't even buy food. People stop trusting the currency altogether and go back to bartering. The Roman economy, which had been one of the most sophisticated in the ancient world, basically collapsed. Trade networks fell apart. Cities that depended on importing food started starving. Tax revenue dropped because money was worthless, which meant the government couldn't pay its armies, which meant more civil wars and more invasions. It's a death spiral, and Rome was caught right in the middle of it. Oh, and did I mention there was also a massive plague? Between 249 and 262 AD, a disease swept through the Roman Empire that historians call the Plague of Cyprian. We don't know exactly what it was. Could have been smallpox, could have been a hemorrhagic fever like Ebola, could have been something that doesn't exist anymore, but we do know it was absolutely devastating. According to historical accounts, at its peak, the plague was killing 5,000 people a day in Rome alone. 5,000 a day. The disease would cause fever, diarrhea, vomiting, and gangrenous throats and limbs. People would go blind. Their hands and feet would rot off while they were still alive. Entire cities were depopulated. Farms were abandoned because there was nobody left to work them. The Roman army, which was already struggling, lost huge numbers of soldiers. Some estimates say the plague killed anywhere from 1 million to over 5 million people, which was a huge chunk of the empire's total population. And remember, this is happening at the same time as the economic collapse and the political chaos and the invasions. Rome is getting hit from every direction at once. Eventually, a guy named Diocletian became emperor in 284 AD and managed to stabilize things, kind of. His solution was to completely restructure the empire. First, he decided the empire was too big for one person to manage, so he split it into eastern and western halves, each with its own emperor. Then he split those halves again, creating 4 zones, each with its own ruler. He called this the Tetrarchy, which means rule of 4. Diocletian also reformed the economy, created a new currency, reorganized the army, and instituted a bunch of new taxes to pay for everything. He basically turned Rome into a military dictatorship with a massive bureaucracy. It worked for a while. The empire stabilized. The borders were secured. The economy started recovering, but Diocletian's reforms came with a huge cost. The government became way more authoritarian. Taxes were crushing, and the split between East and West would eventually become permanent, weakening both halves. After Diocletian retired, there was another civil war over who would be emperor. This time, the winner was a guy named Constantine. And Constantine made a decision that would change history forever. He converted to Christianity. Up until this point, Rome had been pagan. They worshipped Jupiter and Mars and Venus and the whole pantheon of gods. Christians were a minority and were often persecuted. But Constantine saw political value in uniting the empire under one religion. So he legalized Christianity, promoted it, and eventually made it the state religion. This was huge. Christianity spread rapidly across the empire. Within a few generations, paganism was basically dead. Rome went from persecuting Christians to persecuting pagans. Constantine also moved the capital from Rome to a new city in the east that he named after himself, Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. This shift in power from west to east would have massive consequences later. But Constantine's conversion didn't save Rome. If anything, it exposed deeper problems. The empire was now divided not just politically and economically, but also culturally and religiously. The Latin-speaking West and the Greek-speaking East were growing apart. Now let's jump forward to the late 300s. Things have been relatively stable for a few decades. The empire is still split into eastern and western halves, but both are functioning. Then, out of nowhere, a new threat appears. The Huns. Nobody in Rome had ever seen anything like the Huns. They were nomadic warriors from the steppes of Central Asia, and they were absolutely terrifying. They were expert horsemen and archers. They could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. They moved faster than any Roman army could respond. The Huns didn't want to conquer Rome. They wanted to plunder and then disappear. But their arrival triggered something way worse: a mass migration. As the Huns pushed westward, they displaced other tribes. Those tribes had to go somewhere, so they started pushing into Roman territory, not as invaders necessarily, but as refugees looking for safety. One of these tribes was the Goths. They showed up at the Roman border and begged to be let in. Rome agreed, thinking they could use the Goths as soldiers. But Rome treated the Gothic refugees horribly. They were starved, abused, and enslaved. So naturally, the Goths rebelled. In 378 AD, a Gothic army faced off against the Roman Emperor Valens at the Battle of Adrianople. The Romans lost, badly. Valens was killed. 2/3 of the Roman army was destroyed. It was one of the worst military defeats in Roman history. This battle changed everything. It proved that Rome was vulnerable, that barbarian armies could defeat Roman legions, and it opened the floodgates for more migrations and more invasions. In 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. A Gothic army led by a king named Alaric marched into Italy and sacked the city of Rome. Rome hadn't been captured by a foreign enemy in 800 years. The shock was enormous. People across the empire couldn't believe it. Rome, the eternal city, the center of civilization, had been looted by barbarians. Alaric's forces spent 3 days ransacking the city. They stole gold, silver, and treasures. They burned buildings. They killed and enslaved thousands of people. When they finally left, Rome was a shell of what it had been. And this was just the beginning. In 455 AD, another group called the Vandals sacked Rome again. Then, in 472, it got sacked a third time. Each time, the city became weaker, poorer, and more depopulated. By the mid-400s, the Western Roman Empire was barely functioning. The eastern half, based in Constantinople, was still relatively strong, but the West was in total chaos. The Western emperors had become puppets. Real power was held by Germanic military commanders who would install and remove emperors at will. These emperors were often children or incompetent adults who ruled in name only. The last Western emperor was a teenager named Romulus Augustulus. Even his name is ironic, Romulus, after the legendary founder of Rome, Augustulus, which means Little Augustus, marking the first emperor. In 476 AD, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer decided he was done pretending. He deposed Romulus Augustulus, took control of Italy, and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. He declared that the West no longer needed an emperor. And just like that, the Western Roman Empire was over. So after all that, what actually killed Rome? Historians have been debating this for 1500 years, and there's no single answer. It was everything I just described and more, all happening at once. Some historians blame economic collapse, the debasement of currency, the crush in taxes, the breakdown of trade networks. Rome literally went broke. Others blame military failure, the inability to defend the borders, the reliance on barbarian mercenaries, the loss of discipline in the legions. Some point to political instability, decades of civil wars, assassinations, and weak emperors who couldn't hold the empire together. There's the disease factor, multiple plagues that killed millions and weakened the empire at critical moments. Environmental historians argue that climate change played a role. The Roman warm period ended in the 3rd century, leading to colder temperatures, crop failures, and famines. And then there's the lead poisoning theory. Romans used lead extensively. Lead pipes for water, lead cookware, lead as a sweetener in wine. Some researchers think chronic lead poisoning made Romans less intelligent and more violent over generations, contributing to the empire's decline. The truth is probably all of these things combined. Rome didn't fall because of one weakness. It fell because multiple systems failed at the same time, and the empire couldn't handle all those crises at once. Here's the part that should really shock you though. Rome didn't have to fall. Not like this. The Eastern Roman Empire, facing many of the same problems, survived for another 1,000 years. Constantinople didn't fall until 1453, nearly a millennium after Rome collapsed. Why? Because the East adapted. They reformed their economy, maintained a professional army, and kept their government stable. The West could have done the same, but they didn't. They kept making the same mistakes, fighting the same civil wars, debasing the same currency. They refused to change, even as everything around them was crumbling. Rome fell because it stopped being able to solve problems. That's ultimately what doomed them. Not barbarians, not plagues, not lead pipes. The empire lost its ability to adapt and overcome challenges. And once that happened, the end was inevitable. So there you have it, the fall of Rome in under 30 minutes. From the chaos of the 3rd century to the sack of Rome to the final collapse in 476 AD. Economic disaster, political instability, disease, invasion, and a whole lot of bad decisions. The fall of Rome is one of the biggest turning points in human history. When Rome fell, Europe plunged into the Dark Ages. Knowledge was lost. Infrastructure crumbled. It took centuries for civilization to recover. But the lessons from Rome's fall are still relevant today. Economies can collapse if you devalue currency. Empires can crumble if leaders care more about power than governing. Societies can fail if they refuse to adapt to new challenges. Rome lasted over 1,000 years if you count both the Republic and Empire. That's an incredible achievement. But even the mightiest civilizations aren't immortal. Everything eventually ends. If you want to see more history content like this, hit subscribe.